At 9 in the evening, while I was working late, my neighbor called. "Do not come home tonight. Do not ask why." I demanded an explanation. He simply replied that I would thank him in the morning. At 7 the next morning, what I saw on the local news left me frozen with fear. My name is Harold Carmichael. I am 68 years old, and I spent my entire life building a legacy for my family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I had spent 4 decades building my architectural firm from the ground up, sacrificing my youth and my energy to ensure my family would never know the sting of poverty. Tonight, the drafting table felt colder than usual. The heavy scent of graphite and aged paper hung in the air of my downtown office. I was meticulously reviewing the final structural blueprints for a commercial complex, a lucrative project that was supposed to finally secure my permanent retirement. My phone vibrated against the wooden surface, the sudden buzzing shattering the profound silence of the empty floor. I glanced at the screen. It was Stanley Hopkins, my retired neighbor. Stanley was not a man who made casual social calls at 9 in the evening. He was a sharp-eyed military veteran who noticed absolutely everything from a misplaced garbage can to an unfamiliar vehicle parked on our quiet suburban street. I answered the call expecting a minor complaint about my overgrown hedges or a stray package delivery. Instead, his voice came through rushed and hushed, completely devoid of his usual gruff humor. "Do not come home tonight." He spoke the words with a chilling, absolute authority. "Do not ask why. Lock your office doors and stay exactly where you are." I demanded an explanation, feeling a sudden, inexplicable knot tighten in my stomach. I am a grown man, not a child to be ordered around in the dark. I asked him what was going on, pressing him for details, but he immediately cut me off. "You will thank me in the morning, Harold." That was all he said before the line went completely dead. I stood alone in the dim glow of my desk lamp, staring at the silenced device in my hand. The massive downtown building creaked around me, settling into the cold night. A deep sense of unease washed over me. I walked over to the heavy glass doors of my firm, turned the deadbolt, and listened to the satisfying click of the lock sliding into place. I did not go home. I trusted Stanley's instincts over my own pride. That blind trust ultimately saved my life. The night was agonizingly long. I dozed fitfully on the stiff leather sofa in the reception area, my mind racing through every possible catastrophe. Had there been a violent break-in at my property? A neighborhood emergency when dawn finally broke, casting long gray shadows across the city skyline. I woke with a stiff neck and a heavy sinking feeling in my chest. I walked back into my private office and turned on the small television mounted on the wall, switching to the local morning news channel. The anchor looked grim. The broadcast cut to live helicopter footage, and the ceramic coffee mug slipped from my trembling hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. The screen displayed my suburban home, or rather, what was left of it. The roof had completely collapsed inward, plunging into the foundation. The walls were blown outward, reduced to charred, smoking timber and blackened debris. Firefighters were actively dousing the remaining flames of what the news banner described as a massive overnight gas explosion. The reporter's voice drifted through the speakers, stating with grim professionalism that authorities were currently searching the still smoldering rubble for the homeowner. My heart hammered against my ribs in a frantic, deafening rhythm. I was staring directly at my own grave, but the initial shock of the physical destruction was quickly overshadowed by a terrifying realization that dropped into my stomach like a block of solid ice. This was not a tragic accident. My mind immediately went to a tense conversation that had taken place mere days ago. I had recently updated my life insurance policy. It was a comprehensive multi-million-dollar policy that I had maintained for decades to protect my assets. Recently, my son Justin had been aggressively insisting that I restructure the beneficiaries and the payout terms. He had disguised his relentless persistence as filial concern, claiming he wanted to ensure my legacy was protected from excessive taxation and legal probate issues. I had signed the updated paperwork just last week, naming him the sole immediate beneficiary in the event of my accidental death. The timing was entirely too perfect. Gas lines do not simply explode naturally days after a massive life insurance policy is finalized. I touched my face, feeling the cold sweat beading on my skin. I was supposed to be in that house. I was supposed to be asleep in that bed when the gas ignited. I did not call the police. I did not call the fire department to tell them I was alive. An overwhelming primal instinct for self-preservation took over my senses. I grabbed my car keys, left the downtown office, and drove in the exact opposite direction of my destroyed home. I needed a place to think, a place where no one would look for a man who was presumed dead. I ended up at a secluded diner on the absolute edge of the city limits, a place that smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee. I sat in a back booth, pulling my coat collar high, and ordered a black coffee from a tired waitress who barely glanced in my direction. As the bitter liquid burned down my throat, I began to clinically process the recent behavior of my son Justin and his wife Megan. The puzzle pieces were snapping together with horrifying clarity. The narrative of my life had been hijacked by the very people I had spent my entire existence supporting. I vividly recalled a dinner we shared exactly 2 weeks prior. Justin had invited me to an upscale restaurant, masking the occasion as a simple family gathering to celebrate a recent architectural award I had received. But halfway through the meal, the pleasantries evaporated into thin air. Justin had aggressively slid a thick stack of estate planning documents across the pristine white tablecloth. His tone had shifted from conversational to demanding in an instant. He wanted me to sign over the deed to my house into a living trust that he exclusively controlled, arguing that I was getting too old to manage the property taxes and the seasonal maintenance. When I pushed back, refusing to sign away my hard-earned independence blindly, his jaw had clenched tight. The mask of the caring son had slipped completely. He looked at me not with the eyes of a loving child, but with the cold, detached calculation of a predator assessing a stubborn prey. Megan had sat beside him, rolling her eyes and openly scoffing at my hesitation. She had muttered just loud enough for me to hear over the clinking of silverware that I was becoming a stubborn, ungrateful burden. She had complained bitterly to Justin about how their lives were constantly on hold while they waited for me to make sensible financial decisions. I had ignored the insult at the time, chalking it up to her usual abrasive personality and their youthful impatience. Now, sitting in this dingy diner with the news of my exploded house playing on a continuous loop in my head, her words took on a sinister, lethal weight. They did not want to manage my care. They wanted to liquidate my existence entirely. The gas explosion was not an unfortunate tragedy. It was a calculated eviction notice from life itself. Justin had decided that waiting for nature to take its course was simply too inconvenient for his timeline. He needed the money now, and my continued breathing was the only obstacle standing between him and millions of dollars. I looked out the diner window at the empty, sprawling highway. I was 68 years old. I had built commercial buildings that touched the sky. I had weathered devastating economic crashes, personal hardships, and grueling corporate battles. I was absolutely not about to let my own flesh and blood murder me for a quick payout. If my son wanted me dead to solve his financial problems, I would give him exactly what he wanted. I would remain a ghost. I would let him believe he had won his sick game. And from the shadows of my supposed grave, I would meticulously and ruthlessly dismantle his entire world. The grief of losing a son was already fading away, rapidly replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. The war had begun, and I was going to ensure that their victory was the most expensive mistake they ever made. The morning air bit at my skin as I navigated the unfamiliar streets of a neighborhood I rarely visited. My expensive tailored suit felt entirely out of place in front of the dingy convenience store with its flickering neon signs. I pulled my collar up, keeping my head low as I stepped inside. The cashier barely looked up from his magazine when I placed a cheap, prepaid cell phone and a stack of $20 cells on the scratched glass counter. There was no registry, no contract, no digital footprint. I needed absolute invisibility. I walked back to my car, peeling the plastic wrapper off the device, feeling the strange weight of becoming a fugitive in my own life. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, and dialed the only number I had bothered to memorize perfectly over the last 10 years. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Stanley did not offer a greeting. He simply gave me an address, a desolate strip mall on the absolute edge of the county line, and told me to be there in 20 minutes. He hung up before I could utter a single word of agreement. The drive was agonizingly silent. The radio remained off. My mind was a chaotic storm of denial and rage, but beneath it all, a cold, calculated survival instinct was taking the helm. I pulled into the vast, empty parking lot of the abandoned shopping center. Weeds pushed violently through the cracked asphalt, and the faded sun-bleached storefronts stood like hollow monuments to forgotten prosperity. It was the perfect place for a dead man to hold a meeting. A few minutes later, a battered green pickup truck rolled slowly into the lot. It parked parallel to my vehicle. Stanley Hopkins stepped out. He was a man carved from solid granite, a retired military veteran who spoke little and observed everything. He did not walk over with an expression of pity or offer any hollow words of comfort. Pity was a useless currency right now. Stanley treated the situation like a tactical military extraction. He leaned against the hood of my car, his sharp eyes scanning the empty perimeter to ensure we were completely alone. He reached into his heavy jacket pocket and pulled out a small metallic flash drive. He held it out to me, his face set in a grim, immovable line. I took the drive, the cold metal biting against my palm. I asked him what was on it. He told me to plug it into my laptop and see for myself. He said he had been awake late the previous night, brewing a cup of tea in his dark kitchen, when the motion sensor alert from his hidden porch camera pinged his phone. Stanley was not a man who trusted neighborhood security patrols. He had installed his own high-definition infrared system years ago, angling one of the lenses to cover the blind spot between our two properties. My hands trembled slightly as I reached into the back seat for my leather briefcase. I pulled out my laptop, resting it on the steering wheel, and pushed the flash drive into the port. The screen illuminated the dim interior of my car. I opened the file Stanley indicated. The video footage was stark and undeniable, bathed in the eerie glowing green tint of night vision. The timestamp in the bottom corner read 8:30 in the evening. A sleek dark sedan pulled silently up to the curb, parking just outside the reach of the streetlights. The driver door opened. My breath caught in my throat. It was Justin, my own flesh and blood. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man whose college tuition I had paid in full, the son I had fiercely protected from every hardship life had to offer. He did not walk toward the front door. He did not carry a gift or a bottle of wine. He moved with a practiced predatory stealth, slipping through the shadow along the side of my house. The camera caught the metallic glint of a heavy industrial wrench tightly gripped in his right hand. He crouched down right beside the main gas line valve. I watched, paralyzed by a sickening mixture of horror and heartbreak, as my son methodically applied the wrench to the pressurized fittings. He was not acting out of a sudden blind rage. There was no hesitation, no frantic panic in his movements. His actions were deliberate, clinical, and chillingly precise. He was ensuring that the gas would leak slowly, filling the confined space of the basement, turning my entire home into a massive pressurized bomb waiting for a single spark. The spark of a water heater turning on or a refrigerator pilot light would be enough to level the entire structure. He was engineering a catastrophe designed to look like a tragic, unavoidable accident. In that suffocating silence, a painful memory surfaced. Justin was 17, demanding a brand new sports car for his graduation. When I told him he needed to get a summer job to earn the down payment, he had thrown a violent tantrum, screaming that he should not have to work for things that I could easily afford to give him. He had always wanted the reward without the labor. He had always looked for the easiest, fastest shortcut. Now sitting in the damp chill of my car, I realized that his entitlement had not faded with age. It had mutated. It had grown into a monstrous, lethal greed. Murdering his own father was simply the ultimate shortcut to secure his financial future. The video showed Justin standing up, brushing the dirt off his expensive trousers. He looked around once, ensuring the street was empty, before walking calmly back to his sedan. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, typing a quick message. I could easily imagine him texting Megan, informing his willing accomplice that the trap was successfully set. He got into his car and drove away, leaving me a ticking time bomb. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, plunging the car back into shadows. My chest felt tight, as if invisible iron bands were crushing my lungs. The grief of betrayal threatened to drown me, but I forced it down. I pushed the sorrow away, replacing it with a burning, absolute resolve. I looked at Stanley through the open car window. Stanley spoke with absolute clarity. He explained that by the time he realized exactly what Justin was doing, the car was already speeding away. He knew that calling the police immediately might alert Justin, giving him time to prepare an alibi, or claim he was simply checking the meter for a supposed leak. Worse, Stanley knew that if the police intervened too soon, Justin would realize he had failed. He would know I was still alive. And a desperate man drowning in debt does not simply stop when his first plan fails. He would hire someone. He would rig the brakes on my car. He would poison my coffee. He would keep trying until the millions of dollars from the life insurance policy were safely resting in his bank account. Stanley had made the split-second tactical decision to call me at the office instead. By ordering me to stay away, he ensured I survived the inevitable blast, while allowing Justin to believe his twisted execution had gone flawlessly. Stanley looked me dead in the eye and delivered the hardest truth I had ever heard. Harold Carmichael died in that fire. The man who loved that boy burned to ashes in the rubble. I nodded slowly, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Stanley was absolutely right. If I walked into a police station right now and handed over the flash drive, Justin would undoubtedly be arrested for arson and attempted murder. But he would drag the legal process out for years. He would hire defense attorneys who would claim the footage was doctored or that he was under extreme mental distress. He might even manage to secure bail and disappear. A simple arrest was far too merciful for a man who had casually condemned his father to burn alive. The law could take his freedom, but I needed to take everything else first. I needed to dismantle the very foundation of his arrogance. I needed to expose the rot in his marriage, rip away the financial safety net he thought he had secured, and corner him in a trap of his own making. I needed to watch his smug certainty shatter into a million irreparable pieces before the authorities ever touched him. Stanley extended his rough, calloused hand through the window. I shook it firmly. The pact was sealed in the desolate silence of that abandoned parking lot. We agreed that I would remain completely invisible. I would not contact my bank. I would not use my credit cards. I would exist strictly as a ghost. Stanley promised to act as my eyes and ears in the neighborhood, monitoring Justin's inevitable performance as the grieving, devastated son holding press conferences in front of my destroyed home. I started the engine of my car. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. Having the video evidence was the final strike, but to completely paralyze Justin's ambitions, I needed to lock down the multi-million-dollar estate he thought he had just violently inherited. I needed to ensure that when he reached his bloody hands out to collect his prize, he found nothing but an impenetrable vault. I pulled out my new prepaid phone and dialed the private, unlisted number of Cameron Pierce, my fiercely loyal corporate attorney. The time for sorrow had officially ended. The time for absolute destruction had just begun. The faded wallpaper of room number 42 peeled at the corners. It was a stark contrast to the immaculate mahogany walls of my architectural firm. I sat on the edge of a mattress that smelled faintly of industrial bleach and stale tobacco. I had paid for the room in cash using the name Arthur Pendleton. It was an old pseudonym I used years ago for discreet property acquisitions. Now it was my only shield. The world outside this cramped space believed Harold Carmichael was nothing more than ashes buried under collapsed drywall and shattered glass. I stared at the flickering screen of the ancient tube television bolted to the dresser. The local evening news was about to begin. My hands rested on my knees. They were entirely steady. The initial shock of the morning had burned away. It left behind a cold and hollow space in my chest. The news anchor appeared on the screen. His face was arranged in a practiced mask of professional sympathy. He announced a live update from the site of the devastating suburban gas explosion. The camera cut to the scene. The skeletal remains of my home loomed against the darkening sky. Yellow police tape cordoned off the perimeter. Ash drifted through the air like gray snow. Standing right in front of the wreckage, bathed in the glaring light of camera flashes, was my son. Justin wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit. It was the exact suit I had purchased for him 2 years ago. He had promised me then that he was finally ready to take his career seriously. Beside him stood his wife, Megan. Her head rested heavily on his shoulder. She wore an elegant black dress, perfectly chosen to convey mourning without sacrificing style. A reporter thrust a microphone forward. Justin stepped up to the cluster of media personnel. I turned the volume up. The cheap plastic dial cracked under my firm grip. Justin lowered his head. He took a deep, shuddering breath before looking directly into the camera lenses. He spoke with a trembling voice. It was a masterful imitation of a broken man. He told the reporters that his father was his hero. He called me his guiding light and the foundation of their entire family. He paused exactly when a grieving son should pause. He wiped a solitary tear from his cheek with the back of his hand. It was a flawless execution of sorrow. He pleaded with the public for privacy during this unimaginable tragedy. He asked everyone to remember Harold Carmichael, not for the fiery destruction of his home, but for the legacy of love he left behind. Megan tightened her grip on his arm. She buried her face against his lapel to hide her completely dry eyes. I watched the screen, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of his performance. This was not a man crumbling under the weight of an accidental tragedy. This was an actor taking a triumphant bow. I looked at Justin's hands on the television screen. They were perfectly manicured and remarkably steady. They were entirely devoid of the soot and grime he had been covered in just 24 hours earlier. That was when he took an industrial wrench to my gas line. He continued to speak, weaving a narrative out of thin air. He told a local reporter about our supposed final phone call. He claimed we had spoken just hours before the explosion. He said I had told him how proud I was of the man he had become. He said I had given him my blessing to take over the family legacy. It was a complete fabrication. Our last interaction had been a bitter argument over his aggressive demands to control my estate. He was rewriting history on live television. He was officially claiming his inheritance through a carefully constructed public lie. A sharp memory surfaced from the depths of my mind, cutting through the anger. Justin was 24 years old. We were standing in a judge's private chambers after he had wrecked his car while severely under the influence of alcohol. He had cried those exact same tears. He had used that exact same trembling voice. He claimed he swerved to avoid a stray dog begging the judge for mercy. I had paid his exorbitant fines. I had buried the truth to protect his future. I had convinced myself he was just a confused young man making reckless mistakes. I had been a willfully blind fool. I had nurtured the very greed that just tried to kill me. The broadcast continued without interruption. Justin smoothly pivoted the conversation. He mentioned that he would be taking a leave of absence from his job to manage my complex estate. He framed it as a heavy burden. He called it a final duty he owed to his beloved father. My stomach twisted with pure revulsion. He was already laying the public groundwork to liquidate my assets. He wanted the narrative firmly established before the police could even sift through the rubble. He was portraying himself as the responsible, grieving heir, stepping up to handle a chaotic situation. He was controlling the story to prevent anyone from looking too closely at the recent timeline of the massive life insurance policy. He was desperately trying to hide his own mounting financial ruins behind a veil of tragedy. I analyzed his body language with the same intense scrutiny I applied to evaluating structural blueprints. I looked for a flaw. I searched for a microscopic crack in his facade that would reveal a single shred of genuine remorse. There was absolutely nothing. His posture was straight. His gaze was clear and unblinking. He was entirely comfortable standing directly on top of my supposed grave. Megan subtly adjusted her posture to ensure the cameras captured her best angle. She reached up to brush a stray lock of hair from Justin's forehead, projecting the image of a devoted and supportive wife. In that precise moment, the final fraying thread of my paternal affection snapped entirely. It did not break with a loud or dramatic noise. It simply dissolved into cold nothingness. The boy I had taught to throw a baseball ceased to exist. The teenager whose college tuition I had funded by working 80-hour weeks vanished. The man I had forgiven time and time again was completely gone. In his place stood a calculating sociopath who viewed human life as a simple mathematical equation. I realized that my mere survival was a massive liability to him. If I walked into a police precinct tomorrow, he would deny absolutely everything. He would claim the security footage from Stanley's hidden porch camera was a terrible misunderstanding. He would say he was checking the meter because he smelled a gas leak. He would twist himself into the tragic hero who valiantly tried to save his father, but failed. The flawed legal system would tie us up in endless, draining litigation. He would manipulate the courts just as easily as he manipulated those reporters. He would drain my accounts to pay for his aggressive defense. He would drag my reputation through the mud, claiming my old age had made me paranoid and vindictive. I could not allow that to happen. Justice could not be found inside a sterile courtroom with lawyers negotiating plea deals. True and absolute justice had to be delivered personally. It had to be swift, silent, and financially devastating. I turned off the television. The sudden silence in the motel room was deafening, but it was no longer a heavy, oppressive silence of a victim in hiding. It was the sharp, focused silence of a drafting board before the first critical line is drawn. It was the silence of pure, unadulterated potential. I stood up from the sagging mattress. I felt a surge of energy I had not experienced in over a decade. My joints no longer ached with the weight of age. My mind was razor-sharp and exceptionally clear. I walked over to the small laminate desk near the window. I picked up the prepaid burner phone I had purchased earlier that morning from a dingy convenience store. I did not need to mourn a son who never truly existed. I needed to strategize the complete demolition of the monster who took his place. I dialed the secure direct line for Cameron Pierce. He was the only corporate attorney who knew the intricate labyrinth of my financial holdings. I listened to the monotonous ringing on the other end of the line. The grieving son had played his part perfectly for the flashing cameras and the sympathetic public. He believed he had won the ultimate prize. Now the dead father was going to set a financial trap from which there would be absolutely no escape. I waited for Cameron to answer, ready to initiate a war that Justin would never see coming. The rusted air conditioning unit rattled violently against the motel window. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the locked door. I had texted Cameron Pierce exactly 20 minutes ago with an address and a simple command to come alone. Cameron had been my corporate attorney for 30 years. We built my architectural firm together, fighting off hostile takeovers and ruthless developers. He was the only man who knew the precise architecture of my wealth. A sharp double knock echoed through the room. I stood up, walked to the door, and turned the deadbolt. Cameron stepped inside, adjusting his expensive silk tie. Then he looked up. The color completely drained from his face. His leather briefcase slipped from his grip, hitting the stained carpet with a heavy thud. He stared at me as if he were looking at a ghost. He had just watched the morning news. He had seen the charred crater that used to be my home. I closed the door behind him and locked it again. I told him to sit down. Cameron stumbled backward into the solitary armchair, his mouth opening and closing, before he finally managed to ask how I was standing there. I did not give him an emotional speech. I handed him the cheap, prepaid phone where I had transferred a copy of the security footage from Stanley. I watched Cameron press play. I watched the realization hit him. He saw the boy he had known since childhood, the boy he had bought birthday gifts for taking a wrench to my gas line. Cameron handed the phone back, his hands shaking with a mixture of horror and fury. He reached into his coat pocket for his own phone, stating firmly that he was calling the district attorney right now. I grabbed his wrist. I told him absolutely not. Cameron argued with me. He said Justin was a dangerous criminal who needed to be behind bars immediately. He insisted that my life was in active jeopardy. I looked him dead in the eye and explained the brutal reality. If we called the police, Justin would hire a defense team. He would drag my name through the courts. He would claim it was a misunderstanding or a desperate cry for help. He would play the victim. I refused to let my son play the victim. I told Cameron that a prison cell was far too comfortable for a man who tried to burn his father alive. I wanted to understand the absolute depth of his greed. I wanted to know what kind of financial ruin drove him to murder. Cameron understood. He had seen Justin's reckless behavior before. 10 years ago, Justin had quietly embezzled a small sum from a subsidiary of my firm to cover a gambling debt. I had found out. I had forced him to pay it back by docking his salary, but I had kept the incident out of the official records to protect his future. Cameron had warned me then that Justin lacked a fundamental moral compass. I had ignored the warning out of blind paternal love. Now the bill for my ignorance was due. I instructed Cameron to initiate an immediate silent audit of my entire estate. I needed to see every single financial move Justin and his wife Megan had made over the past year. I commanded Cameron to build an impenetrable fortress around my assets. Justin believed he was about to inherit everything through the life insurance policy and my primary accounts. I told Cameron to quietly transfer the bulk of my liquid wealth, my property deeds, and my offshore investments into a newly formed corporate shell. A blind trust managed exclusively by Cameron, totally insulated from probate court. Justin would inherit the titles, but the actual equity would be completely inaccessible. He would reach into the gold mine and find nothing but solid rock. Cameron opened his laptop, his professional instincts overriding his shock. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed my secure financial portals. We spent the next 3 hours systematically erasing my financial footprint, moving millions of dollars into untouchable holding companies. As Cameron dug deeper into the accounts, his expression grew increasingly grim. He found unauthorized access attempts on my primary banking portals dating back 3 months. Justin had been probing my defenses. He had been checking the balances, calculating his exact payout. The attempted murder was not a sudden crime of passion. It was the final phase of a long, cold business transaction. My son had appraised my life and decided I was worth more dead. Cameron finalized the last digital transfer. He looked up the harsh light of the laptop, illuminating his face in the dim motel room. The trap was officially set. Justin and Megan thought they had won. They thought they were rich. They were about to march into a legal labyrinth designed to bankrupt them, expose them, and destroy every shred of their arrogant lives. I told Cameron to go back to his office and wait for the grieving son to call. Justin would be desperate for the money, and when he reached out, we would be ready to tighten the noose. 48 hours dragged by in that sterile motel room, with agonizing slowness. The air constantly smelled of cheap pine disinfectant and stale cigarette smoke deeply embedded in the carpet fibers. I paced the narrow space between the sagging bed and the scuffed dresser, existing entirely in a state of suspended animation. The television remained off. I could not stomach seeing my son perform his grotesque pantomime of grief on the local news for another second. Every passing hour felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I was a ghost haunting a roadside inn, waiting for the necessary ammunition to strike back at the living. Cameron Pierce arrived exactly at the 48-hour mark. He did not knock loudly. He tapped twice, a sharp and discreet sound that barely carried over the rattling hum of the broken air conditioning unit. I unlocked the heavy metal door and pulled it open. Cameron stepped inside swiftly, casting a quick glance over his shoulder before I slid the deadbolt back into place. My corporate attorney looked severely depleted. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, and dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. He carried a thick, bulging manila folder tightly against his chest. He placed it on the small circular table by the window with a heavy, definitive thud. The physical weight of my son's betrayal was contained right there in those compressed pages. Cameron did not offer pleasantries. He unbuttoned his jacket and sat down, letting out a long, exhausted breath. He told me to sit because the reality of the situation was far worse than simple, impatient greed. What his forensic accountants had uncovered over the last 2 days painted a terrifying picture of a family teetering on the absolute edge of violent destruction. I took the chair opposite him, staring at the closed folder. Cameron opened it and began to lay out the devastating dossier of my son's secret life. He started with Megan. 2 years ago, Justin had proudly announced that his wife was opening a high-end boutique downtown, specializing in imported silk garments and luxury accessories. At every family dinner, they had bragged endlessly about her brilliant entrepreneurial spirit and her rapidly growing client list. I had believed them completely. I had even paid for the first entire year of their commercial lease as a generous wedding gift, wanting to support their ambition. Cameron revealed that the entire business was a spectacular hemorrhaging illusion. The store had not turned a single dollar of profit in 18 months. Megan had completely drained their joint savings accounts to keep up the lavish appearance of success, buying fake inventory and paying for aggressive marketing campaigns that generated zero revenue. When the traditional banks inevitably cut off her lines of credit, she did not confess her failure. Instead, she turned to alternative, highly dangerous sources of funding. Cameron slid a stark financial summary across the table. Megan had taken out 3 separate massive loans from unlicensed underground creditors operating out of the city's industrial district. These were not financial institutions that sent polite collection notices in the mail. These were ruthless individuals who broke bones and burned properties when weekly payments were missed. The interest rates were astronomical, compounding at a predatory speed that made escape impossible. Megan was drowning in a violent tidal wave of illicit debt, and the water was rapidly rising above her head. I sat back in my chair, trying to process the sheer magnitude of her deception. But Cameron was not finished. He warned me that Justin was not an innocent victim of his wife's terrible business acumen. He was an active, deeply compromised co-conspirator. Cameron pulled a thick stack of bank transfer receipts from the folder and fanned them out across the cheap laminate table. They were authorized withdrawal slips from the primary reserve accounts of my architectural firm. $50,000 had been systematically and quietly drained over the past 4 months. The withdrawals were carefully executed in specific increments just under the federal reporting limits to avoid triggering any automatic fraud alerts. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto the signature line at the bottom of each slip. My breath caught sharply in my throat. It was my own signature. Or rather, it was a flawless, terrifyingly accurate forgery. Every loop, every sharp angle, the specific slant of the letters, it was an absolute masterpiece of deception. A sickening memory instantly materialized in my mind. The previous summer, I had given Justin limited access to the firm's administrative files, hoping to slowly integrate him into the executive operations of the business he would one day inherit. I had wanted him to learn the ropes. Instead, he had used that privileged access to study my handwriting. He had sat in my office, likely practicing my signature hundreds of times on scrap paper until he could replicate it perfectly. He had stolen from the very legacy he was supposedly so eager to protect, weaponizing my trust against me. Cameron explained the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of their criminal situation. The embezzled $50,000 had not gone toward saving the business or paying off the principal of the loans. That money had likely gone entirely toward paying the exorbitant weekly interest just to keep the violent collectors from showing up at their front door. It was a mere drop in the bucket, a desperate stalling tactic. They were trapped in a financial corner with absolutely no legal or rational way out. The walls were closing in, and the threat of physical violence was no longer a possibility. It was an impending guarantee. The motive behind the explosion suddenly crystallized with horrifying clarity. The multi-million-dollar life insurance policy payout was no longer just a greedy windfall for a spoiled son. It was their singular, desperate lifeline. It was the only way to instantly generate enough clean cash to pay off the underground criminals who were undoubtedly threatening their lives. My son had not tampered with the gas line out of spontaneous malice or arrogant impatience. It was an act of pure, calculated survival. Justin had looked at his mounting lethal debts, looked at his father, and made a cold, sociopathic business decision. He traded my life to save his own skin. He had decided that my existence was the only acceptable collateral for his mistakes. The conflict entirely shifted within my mind. This was no longer a tragic story of familial betrayal. This was a desperate criminal conspiracy, and I was the designated casualty. The heartbreak I had felt while watching the news broadcast hardened into a diamond-tight resolve. The men Megan owed money to were undoubtedly dangerous, but they were absolutely nothing compared to a father who had been betrayed, targeted, and left for dead. I realized I was no longer dealing with a disappointing child who needed to be disciplined. I was dealing with a cornered, lethal animal that needed to be surgically removed from society. I absorbed the full weight of the dossier in total silence. Cameron watched me carefully, waiting for my reaction. He was prepared for me to break down, to yell, or to demand that we call the authorities immediately. I did none of those things. The grief was completely gone, eradicated by the searing heat of absolute clarity. If Justin did not secure that massive insurance payout, the underground creditors would eventually tear his life apart. They would take his house, his cars, and everything he valued. I decided right then, sitting in that dim motel room, that I would not lift a single finger to save him from the wolves he had invited to his own door. I would let the very trap he had built snap shut on his own neck. I looked across the table at Cameron and delivered my next set of instructions in a calm, unwavering voice. I told my attorney to freeze the compromised corporate accounts immediately. He was to contact the bank and report a suspected external security breach, locking down every single cent of the firm's liquid capital. I wanted the financial ground beneath Justin to instantly turn to quicksand. We would not go to the police with the forgery just yet. We would let Justin believe his embezzlement had gone unnoticed in the chaos of my presumed death. I wanted him to feel the intoxicating rush of victory before I systematically ripped it all away. I wanted him to walk into the bank desperate for the funds to pay his violent creditors, only to find the vault doors sealed shut. We were going to cut off his air supply slowly. We were going to use his own desperation as the ultimate weapon against him. Cameron gathered the documents, his face reflecting a grim, focused determination. We were no longer simply protecting an estate. We were preparing for a complete and total annihilation. The engine of the dark rental sedan idled with a low, continuous hum that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my leather shoes. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, completely shielded by the heavy aftermarket tint applied to the windows. I was parked just outside the wrought iron gates of the Oakwood Cemetery, positioned on a slight incline that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the grounds. The morning air was crisp and unseasonably cold, carrying the heavy metallic scent of impending rain and the faint fragrance of crushed lilies. A short distance away, a green velvet canopy had been erected over a freshly dug plot. It is a profoundly surreal, entirely disjointed psychological experience to sit in comfortable silence and watch the logistical preparations for your own burial. Men in dark woolen suits arranged velvet folding chairs in neat symmetrical rows. A silver hearse pulled slowly up the winding gravel path, its tires crunching loudly in the quiet morning air. It carried a beautiful, polished mahogany casket with brass fittings. I knew, for an absolute fact, that the expensive wooden box was completely empty. It held only weighted sandbags and perhaps some of the ashes swept up from a house that my only son had deliberately set on fire. I gripped the leather steering wheel, letting the smooth material ground me in reality. My hands were remarkably steady. The initial waves of paralyzing shock and crushing parental despair had burned away entirely over the past 48 hours, leaving behind a terrifying and brilliant clarity. I was a dead man watching the living, and the living were putting on a spectacular, nauseating performance. People began to arrive in a slow, steady trickle, crossing the manicured emerald lawn in somber, quiet clusters. I raised a pair of high-powered binoculars to my eyes, adjusting the focal ring to bring the faces into sharp relief. I recognized dozens of them instantly. There were senior architectural partners from my firm, men and women I had worked alongside for 3 decades. Their faces were etched with genuine shock and profound sorrow. I saw my former secretary wiping away tears with a crumpled tissue. I saw old friends from the country club neighbors I had known for 30 years, and clients whose corporate headquarters I had personally designed. I spotted Stanley standing near the back perimeter of the gathering crowd. He wore a dark military surplus coat, his posture rigid and unyielding. He played his part flawlessly, bowing his head in silent, respectful mourning, completely betraying the fact that he knew I was sitting less than 200 yards away, watching the entire spectacle unfold. Cameron Pierce stood near the front row, his expression a masterful mask of professional stoicism. He held the secrets of my frozen empire locked away in his mind, playing the role of the devastated family lawyer, while quietly preparing the financial trap we had meticulously designed the night before. Watching these genuinely grieving people, I felt a brief, sharp pang of guilt for the deception I was forcing them to endure. They were shedding real tears for a man they believed had died a horrific, agonizing death in a midnight inferno. But that fleeting guilt was necessary collateral damage. To protect my legacy and deliver absolute unvarnished justice, the illusion of my demise had to remain perfectly intact. Then a sleek black town car glided through the cemetery gates and rolled to a stop near the canopy. The driver rushed around to open the rear doors, and my son and daughter-in-law stepped out onto the gravel path. Megan wore a sharply tailored black dress that clung tightly to her figure, looking entirely more suited for an upscale evening cocktail party than a solemn memorial service. She wore a wide-brimmed black hat and oversized dark sunglasses, deliberately shielding her face from the morning sun and the prying, sympathetic eyes of the surrounding mourners. As they walked arm in arm toward the front row of reserved chairs, I observed her body language with forensic clinical precision. There was absolutely no heavy slump of grief in her shoulders. She did not lean on her husband for emotional support. She walked with a crisp, impatient, rigid energy. She sat down in the front row, crossed her legs, and immediately snapped open her small designer clutch. I watched through those magnified lenses as she pulled out her cell phone, holding it low in her lap to hide the glowing screen. She was not checking for heartfelt messages of condolence from distant relatives. Her thumbs moved rapidly, aggressively across the digital keyboard, her head tilted downward in deep concentration. Every few minutes she would lift her head, scan the crowd with visible intense annoyance, check her diamond watch, and then immediately return to frantically typing on her phone. She was deeply, profoundly inconvenienced by this entire emotional charade. Her father-in-law's funeral was nothing more than a tedious administrative hurdle on her direct path to sudden unearned wealth. I remembered the devastating dossier Cameron had compiled. I remembered the violent underground creditors breathing down her neck, threatening her physical safety over her failed boutique business. She was undoubtedly texting them right at that very moment, promising those ruthless men that the massive life insurance payout was only days away. She was trading my non-existent ashes for a temporary extension on her miserable life. Justin stood right beside her, playing the role of the shattered, grieving heir with sickening theatrical perfection. He stood tall, greeting the arriving guests with weak, trembling handshakes and tight, tearful embraces. He dabbed at his dry eyes with a pristine white linen handkerchief, accepting their whispered sympathies with a tragic, practiced nod of his head. He was the very picture of a devastated, loyal son grappling with an unimaginable loss. But the performance was incredibly fragile, a thin veneer covering a rotting core. The true monstrous nature of my son revealed itself exactly 20 minutes into the memorial service. The pastor had just finished delivering a moving, powerful eulogy about my lifelong dedication to my family and my contributions to the city skyline. As the final prayer concluded and the guests began to stand and move slowly toward the designated reception area, Justin abruptly broke away from the lingering crowd. He did not go to the mahogany casket to say a final quiet goodbye to his father. He did not stand respectfully to receive the final condolences of my oldest friends. He moved with sudden, aggressive, singular purpose toward a man standing awkwardly near the outer edge of the cemetery plots. The man wore a cheap gray suit and carried a thick leather portfolio under his arm. I recognized him instantly from my own previous dealings with the underwriting department. He was a senior claims adjuster for the life insurance conglomerate. I adjusted the focus dial on my binoculars, zooming in tight on the escalating interaction. Justin backed the insurance adjuster toward a large, polished granite headstone completely oblivious to the sacred, quiet nature of his immediate surroundings. The carefully constructed mask of the grieving son had vanished entirely in the blink of an eye. Justin's face was flushed dark red with barely contained anger. He jabbed his index finger aggressively into the adjuster's chest, his jaw locked in a hostile, demanding snarl. He was arguing. He was aggressively, ruthlessly negotiating the immediate release of the policy funds right beside my empty grave. The adjuster held up his hands in a frantic, placating gesture, clearly trying to de-escalate the volatile situation. He was likely attempting to explain the mandatory legal waiting periods the standard bureaucratic holds and the active arson investigation protocols required by the authorities for such a massive multi-million-dollar payout. Justin was absolutely not having it. He leaned in close, his posture intensely threatening and reeking of sheer panic. He was suffocating under the crushing weight of his corporate embezzlements and his wife's illicit criminal debts. He needed that money deposited into his accounts immediately, and he was visibly enraged that the slow administrative machinery of the insurance corporation was delaying his financial salvation. Watching my son demand his blood money, while standing directly over the plot where he sincerely believed my charred, fragmented remains lay buried, was the most grotesque display of human depravity I had ever witnessed in my entire life. As I sat in the cold, tinted silence of the rental car, observing this sickening display, a profound and permanent psychological shift occurred within my soul. The final, agonizing fragments of parental love simply evaporated into the cold morning air. The heavy, suffocating blanket of paternal grief that had weighed me down since the night of the explosion lifted completely and permanently from my shoulders. In its place, an absolute icy and terrifying liberation flooded my veins. I was no longer a heartbroken father mourning a lost, misguided son. I was a man who had been coldly targeted for slaughter by a financial parasite. The angry, demanding man negotiating with the insurance adjuster was not the child I had raised. He was a dangerous, desperate criminal who had made a catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. He had fundamentally underestimated my intelligence, my resilience, and my absolute willingness to fight back with ruthless precision. He sincerely believed he was the brilliant architect of my destruction, but he was entirely blind to the fact that he was currently standing dead center in the middle of a trap I had meticulously designed to destroy him. The liberation I felt was intoxicating. For decades I had carried the heavy burden of providing for him, protecting him, covering up his mistakes, and bailing him out of his self-inflicted disasters. I had allowed my love to blind me to his sociopathic nature, but his attempt on my life had severed that bond with surgical finality. I owed him absolutely nothing. Not my money, not my legacy, and certainly not my life. I lowered the binoculars and placed them carefully on the passenger seat beside my briefcase. I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow or regret. I felt an exhilarating razor-sharp focus that sharpened my senses and hardened my resolve. Every lingering doubt about the severe path I had chosen was permanently eradicated by the sight of his aggressive, naked greed. I would not allow him to see a single penny of my legacy. I would let him fight a losing battle with the insurance company while Cameron tied the assets in knots. I would let him drown slowly in his mounting, insurmountable debts. I would let the violent men Megan owed money to tighten the screws and turn their lives into a waking nightmare. I would remain perfectly dead to the world, operating invisibly from the shadows alongside Cameron and Stanley. We would gather every piece of necessary financial evidence, every forged signature, and every desperate text message to orchestrate their absolute undeniable downfall. I started the engine of the rental sedan, feeling the gentle vibration travel through the steering wheel. The low, steady rumble filled the cabin, a fitting mechanical soundtrack to my new reality. I put the car in drive and slowly pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the sparse morning traffic. I left the Oakwood Cemetery, the empty mahogany casket, and my former life entirely behind me without a single backward glance. The phantom had officially been born in the ashes of their betrayal, and the impending reckoning was going to be absolute and merciless. I drove toward the city, ready to begin the systematic dismantling of the monsters who thought they could bury me. Cameron Pierce did not knock this time. He simply unlocked the motel room door using the spare key I had given him and stepped inside. The heavy rain outside pounded against the asphalt, but the look on my attorney's face silenced the storm. He held a single manila folder tightly against his chest. He threw his soaking wet trench coat over the back of a cheap plastic chair and placed the folder on the small table. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly disturbed. I asked him what he had found. Cameron took a deep breath and explained that his paralegal had just intercepted a highly irregular filing at the downtown probate court. Justin had not wasted a single second playing the grieving son in private. While he wept for the television cameras, he had his legal team file a newly discovered revised will. Cameron opened the folder and slid a copy of the document across the table. I stared at the crisp white paper. My name was typed at the top, but the words that followed were entirely foreign to me. For my entire adult life, I had dedicated a substantial portion of my wealth to a foundation that provided housing for underprivileged children. It was an organization I had named after my late wife. I grew up with absolutely nothing, and building that foundation to honor her memory was my proudest achievement. Justin had always hated my philanthropy. He viewed every single dollar I gave to an orphan as a dollar stolen directly from his inheritance. My original will mandated that 60% of my entire estate would go directly to that charity. The document Justin filed completely erased them. Every single charitable donation was zeroed out. The revised will granted Justin immediate and uncontested liquid access to all of my assets. There were no trusts. There were no financial guardians. There were no waiting periods. It was a direct pipeline to my entire life savings. I pulled the document closer to examine the final page. My eyes locked onto the ink at the bottom. It was my signature. The familiar sharp curve of the first letter and the long sweeping tail of the last were there. But I had never signed this paper. I looked up at Cameron. I told him this was a forgery. Cameron nodded slowly. He pointed out that it was not just a clumsy tracing done in a panic. It was a professional masterclass in document fraud. He had already sent a digital scan to a forensic handwriting expert he kept on retainer. The expert confirmed it was a near-perfect replica, but noted the microscopic hesitations in the pen strokes that proved it was drawn by an imposter. The expert found that the pressure applied to the paper was entirely uniform. A natural signature flows with varying pressure, but a forged one is drawn with tense, calculated precision. The ink analysis showed it was signed with a highly specific fountain pen I had stopped using 3 years ago. Justin had likely stolen the pen from my home office to make the fake document look as authentic as possible. A cold, heavy realization settled into my bones. You do not hire a professional forger overnight. Finding someone with that level of criminal skill takes time. It takes dark network connections and massive upfront payments. This meant Justin had been planning my death long before the gas line was ever touched. He had commissioned this fraudulent will months ago. The explosion was not a sudden act of financial desperation. It was the grand finale of a meticulously choreographed assassination plot. My son had sat across from me at Sunday dinners, smiling and asking about my day, while he had a forged will sitting in a safe, waiting for the perfect moment to kill me. He had toasted to my health with a glass of expensive wine, knowing he had already paid a criminal to sign away my legacy. The sheer scale of his premeditation required a completely different approach. I could not simply walk into the police station and declare I was alive. If Justin had the foresight to hire a master forger months in advance, he absolutely had contingency plans. He would claim I had signed the will during a moment of mental decline. He would use the money he stole from my company to hire ruthless defense attorneys to bury the truth in endless litigation. He would manipulate a jury by crying about how his mind was shattered by his father burning alive in a tragic accident. I handed the fraudulent document back to Cameron. I did not raise my voice. I felt an absolute freezing calm wash over my entire body. The emotional tether to my child was completely severed. He was no longer my son. He was a dangerous adversary who needed to be dismantled. I told Cameron that we were going to let Justin believe the forged will was moving through the courts seamlessly. We were going to build a trap so flawless that by the time the steel jaws snapped shut, he would have absolutely nothing left. Not a single dollar. Not a shred of his reputation. We needed bait. We needed something so incredibly tempting that Justin would abandon his careful planning and make a fatal, reckless mistake. I looked out the motel window into the pouring rain and began to construct the architecture of his ruin. Justin was arrogant, but he was currently fueled by absolute financial panic. The underground lenders were still breathing down his neck. The life insurance policy would take weeks or months to clear the arson investigation protocols. He needed immediate cash. I instructed Cameron to use the corporate shell we had established to quietly absorb the real estate assets. But we needed to give Justin a glimmer of hope. We needed him to think he had found a secret stash of untraceable wealth that would solve his immediate problems. If we blocked everything outright, his panic might drive him to flee the country before we could properly destroy him. I paced the worn carpet of the motel room, formulating the trap. I told Cameron to invent an obstacle, a bureaucratic nightmare that would stall the probate court just long enough to make Justin sweat. Cameron smiled grimly. He suggested we use the fire inspector report. We could anonymously flag a discrepancy in the initial findings, forcing the insurance company to freeze the payout pending a secondary federal review. This would cut off his primary escape route. Then we would present the bait. We would let Justin discover the existence of a private physical asset that survived the blast. An asset he could touch but could not easily open. I outlined the concept of a fireproof safe box, hidden deep within a private, secure vault facility. We would seed the rumor that this box contained bearer bonds. Untraceable, unregistered millions that I had supposedly hoarded over my lifetime. Justin was greedy and he was desperate. The prospect of millions of dollars in untraceable cash would be entirely irresistible to him. He would not wait for the legal system. He would try to steal it. And to steal it, he would have to expose his true nature on a recorded medium. Cameron agreed with the strategy. He packed the fraudulent will back into his leather briefcase. He promised to file the necessary anonymous injunctions by morning. He would ensure the probate judge received an anonymous tip regarding the authenticity of the signature, forcing a quiet delay. Justin would wake up believing he was a millionaire, but by noon he would find out his money was trapped behind an impenetrable wall of red tape. That was when Cameron would call him into the law office and plant the seed about the secret vault. I watched Cameron leave the motel room, stepping back out into the freezing rain. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I walked into the cramped bathroom and stared at my reflection in the stained mirror. The man looking back at me was forever changed. The father who had worked tirelessly to build a comfortable life for his family had been incinerated in that house fire. I was a phantom operating entirely outside the boundaries of normal human affection. I washed my face with cold water, gripping the edges of the porcelain sink. Justin thought he was the mastermind. He thought he had executed the perfect crime. He had no idea he was playing a game against a man who spent 40 years designing structures meant to withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. I was going to construct a psychological prison for him. I was going to let him lock himself inside. And when the time was perfectly right, I would be the one to throw away the key. The rain continued to batter the cheap glass of my motel window in a relentless rhythm. But inside the cramped room, my focus was absolute. I sat at the small laminate table with a pair of heavy noise-canceling headphones pressed tightly over my ears. On the screen of my laptop, a simple audio program pulsed with a steady green line. Cameron Pierce had positioned a highly sensitive recording device directly beneath the polished mahogany of his conference room table. I was about to attend the most important meeting of my life, completely invisible, listening as my son attempted to cash in the chips of my murder. The green wave spiked sharply as the heavy oak door of Cameron's office clicked open. The sharp clicking of Megan's designer heels echoed through the audio feed, followed instantly by the heavier, confident stride of my son. Justin did not sound like a man who had just buried his father. His voice carried a breezy, arrogant lightness as he greeted my attorney. He even made a casual remark about the terrible downtown traffic, a mundane complaint that felt entirely grotesque given the circumstances of our gathering. Megan chimed in, her tone dripping with an artificial sweetness, complimenting the panoramic view from the high-rise window. They were performing, but the performance was incredibly lazy. They believed they were in the final stretch. They were treating a prestigious law firm as a simple bank teller window where they could make their ultimate glorious withdrawal. I closed my eyes and pictured the conference room. I knew exactly where they were sitting. Justin would be in the high-backed leather chair facing the window, projecting dominance and entitlement. Cameron welcomed them with his trademark professional chill. He offered them water or coffee, which they quickly declined. Justin was far too eager to get down to business. He smoothly transitioned the conversation, dropping his voice an entire octave to simulate a heavy, grieving heart. He told Cameron that the last few days had been an absolute nightmare, an unimaginable emotional burden, and that he simply wanted to finalize the estate to find some much-needed closure. The sheer audacity of his performance made my jaw clench. He spoke of emotional closure while actively trying to steal the legacy I had bled my entire life to build. Justin did not waste any time getting to his primary objective. He immediately brought up the revised will. This was the spectacular forgery he had miraculously discovered in a supposedly overlooked safe deposit box. He spoke of the document with total, unwavering confidence, declaring that it officially superseded all previous legal arrangements. He stated that the new will clearly outlined his immediate uncontested access to the primary liquid assets. He specifically targeted the $2 million commercial trust. He demanded that the funds be released and transferred to his personal accounts by the end of the business week. He framed the request as an absolute necessity, claiming there were massive logistical expenses related to the funeral, the property cleanup, and the ongoing management of my sudden absence. Listening to his demands, the absolute mathematical precision of his greed became perfectly clear. He needed that specific $2 million trust because it was the most fluid asset in my entire portfolio. It was clean cash he could wire instantly to his violent underground creditors to save his own skin. He spoke of his rights as the sole heir with a terrifying sense of entitlement. He expected Cameron to simply nod, stamp a piece of paper, and hand him the keys to the kingdom. Megan added her own subtle layer of pressure, stating softly that the tragic ordeal had taken a severe physical toll on Justin's health. She argued that expediting the financial transfers was the only compassionate course of action for a grieving family. Through the headphones, I heard the crisp rustle of paper as Cameron opened his files. I knew exactly what expression my attorney was wearing. It would be a mask of polite, immovable bureaucracy. Cameron cleared his throat. His voice was calm, measured, and completely devoid of the eager compliance Justin was expecting. Cameron expressed his deepest sympathies once again, but then he firmly applied the brakes. He informed Justin that a $2 million liquidation was entirely impossible under the current legal circumstances. The audio wave on my screen flattened completely for a fraction of a second as the silence in the conference room became absolute. Justin asked what Cameron meant, his voice tightening instantly. The breezy arrogance was suddenly replaced by a sharp edge of genuine concern. Cameron meticulously began to lay out the insurmountable obstacles we had constructed during the night. He explained that because my death occurred in a massive residential fire, the life insurance conglomerate had initiated a mandatory comprehensive secondary review. The city fire marshal had not yet issued a conclusive cause of the blast. Until the official report explicitly ruled out arson or foul play, the insurance company had placed a hard freeze on all related payouts. Cameron stated that this was a standard federal protocol for high-value policies and completely out of his legal control. I heard Justin shift violently in his leather chair. The expensive material creaked loudly through the microphone. He argued aggressively that the fire was obviously a tragic accident caused by a faulty gas main in an old house. He demanded to know why the insurance company was dragging their feet when the situation was so agonizingly clear. He insisted that Cameron leverage his corporate weight to force the insurance executives to release the funds immediately. Cameron remained entirely unfazed. He gently reminded Justin that strong-arming a federal investigation was a serious criminal offense, and that any aggressive pushback from the legal team would only make the insurance adjusters significantly more suspicious. Then Cameron delivered the second devastating blow. He addressed the revised will. He told Justin that the probate court had unexpectedly flagged the document for verification. Cameron cited the sudden appearance of the new will, which drastically altered my decades-long charitable contributions, as the primary trigger for the delay. The court required a mandatory validation period to authenticate my signature before any assets could be legally transferred. Cameron explained that this forensic process could take anywhere from 6 to 8 months, depending entirely on the court's administrative backlog. He apologized smoothly for the inconvenience, but insisted his hands were completely tied by the rigid mechanics of probate law. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The microphone peaked, sending a harsh burst of static hitting my eardrums as Justin slammed both of his fists down onto the solid mahogany desk. The sheer physical force of the blow echoed through the empty motel room. His voice shattered its carefully maintained composure. He shouted at Cameron, his words laced with pure, unfiltered panic. He yelled that he did not have 6 months to wait for a group of incompetent bureaucrats to verify a signature. He screamed that the money belonged to him right now and that he needed access to the commercial trust by Friday at the absolute latest. Megan tried to intervene to save the performance. I heard her whispering his name, trying to pull him back from the edge of his emotional collapse, but Justin completely ignored her. He was suffocating. The invisible hands of his underground creditors were tightening around his throat, and the massive fortune he had murdered his father to obtain was suddenly locked behind unbreakable glass. He paced the room. I could hear his heavy, frantic footsteps moving away from the table and back again. He ranted about the incompetence of the legal system, cursing the insurance company, and hurling vicious insults at Cameron for failing to do his job. His absolute desperation stripped away every single layer of the morning sun. He explicitly stated that without an immediate cash injection, his entire life was going to completely collapse. He demanded that Cameron find a legal loophole, secure a bridge loan against the frozen trust, or utilize any mechanism to advance him the cash immediately. He practically begged, his voice cracking with genuine terror. It was not the terror of a man who missed his father. It was the absolute paralyzing terror of a man who realized his executioners were waiting at his front door, and his pockets were completely empty. Cameron let the tense silence stretch out after Justin's frantic outburst. When my attorney finally spoke, his voice was chillingly cold. He told Justin that emotional outbursts would not alter the law. He stated definitively that no respectable financial institution would offer a bridge loan against an estate that was currently under active federal investigation for potential arson and fraud. Cameron suggested that Justin go home, console his wife, and prepare for a very long, difficult administrative winter. The meeting was effectively over. I listened as Justin and Megan stormed out of the office, the heavy door slamming violently behind them. The green audio wave on my laptop screen settled back into a steady, quiet rhythm. I took off the headphones and placed them on the desk. A profound sense of icy satisfaction washed through my veins. The trap was holding flawlessly. My son had walked into that room expecting a royal coronation, and he had walked out facing his own absolute ruin. The pressure was mounting rapidly, and I knew with absolute certainty that his desperation would soon force him to make the final fatal mistake I was waiting for. The heavy rain had finally ceased by late afternoon, leaving the sky over the city a bruised purple. Inside the dim motel room, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the small refrigerator and the soft, steady hum of my laptop cooling fan. I sat perfectly still at the edge of the sagging mattress, staring intently at the glowing screen. I had connected a pair of high-fidelity studio headphones to the computer, isolating myself entirely from the outside world. On the monitor, a sophisticated audio surveillance program displayed a flat, vibrating green line. Cameron Pierce had successfully concealed a military-grade transmitting microphone directly beneath the lip of his massive mahogany conference table earlier that morning. I was preparing to attend the most critical meeting of my entire life as an invisible, omniscient observer. The green wave on my screen suddenly spiked violently as the heavy oak door of Cameron's office clicked open. The sharp, rapid clicking of Megan's designer heels echoed through the audio feed, followed instantly by the heavier, erratic stride of my son. Justin did not sound like a man who had just buried his father in a solemn cemetery ceremony. His breathing was shallow and fast, carrying the distinct, ragged rhythm of a cornered animal. He did not bother with pleasantries or performative grief. The second the heavy office door clicked shut, he began pacing the length of the room. The microphone picked up the frantic squeaking of his leather shoes against the polished hardwood floor. He immediately demanded to know if Cameron had managed to bypass the insurance freeze or secure a bridge loan against the frozen corporate holding accounts. His voice was pitched high, vibrating with a raw, unfiltered panic that he could no longer suppress. The underground creditors were undoubtedly tightening the noose, turning his daily existence into a waking nightmare of physical threats and relentless extortion. I closed my eyes and pictured the conference room with absolute clarity. Cameron would be sitting perfectly upright behind his massive desk, his expression a mask of immovable legal bureaucracy. Through the headphones, I heard my attorney clear his throat with deliberate slowness. Cameron's voice was calm, measured, and completely devoid of the eager compliance Justin was desperately praying for. Cameron expressed his deepest professional regrets. He informed my son that the federal arson investigation had escalated, cementing an impenetrable legal blockade over every single liquid asset tied to my estate. The traditional banking avenues were completely sealed off. I heard a sound that was half gasp, half sob, escape. Megan's lips. She collapsed into one of the leather chairs, the heavy material creaking under her sudden weight. Justin let out a vicious guttural curse, slamming his open palm against the wall. He was suffocating, and the multi-million-dollar fortune he had murdered me to obtain was trapped behind an unbreakable wall of red tape. Cameron let the heavy, toxic silence stretch across the room for several agonizing moments. He allowed the absolute reality of their financial destruction to settle deeply into their bones before he deployed the meticulously constructed bait. Cameron shifted in his chair, the rustle of crisp paper amplifying through the audio feed. He adopted a tone of cautious administrative curiosity. He told Justin that while the primary accounts were frozen, his paralegal team had uncovered a highly irregular, isolated anomaly during their deep forensic dive into my oldest financial records. Cameron explained that over 2 decades ago, long before the digital banking revolution transformed the global economy, I had secured a private, off-the-grid storage unit. The unit was located deep within the subterranean levels of the Sterling Depository, an archaic but heavily fortified private vault facility situated on the extreme edge of the industrial district. I listened closely as Justin stopped his frantic pacing. The sheer mention of a hidden asset arrested his panic instantly. Cameron casually dropped the critical payload. He stated that the original manifest attached to the vault lease indicated that the physical box housed a substantial concentrated quantity of high-yield corporate bearer bonds. A dense, suffocating silence blanketed the conference room. Even through the digital audio feed, I could vividly feel the atmosphere shift. Cameron meticulously clarified the exact nature of the asset for them. He explained that bearer bonds were relics of a bygone financial era. They functioned essentially as cold, hard cash. They were completely unregistered, utterly untraceable, and immediately negotiable by whoever physically possessed the paper certificates. Cameron estimated that the specific bonds locked in the vault were currently valued at roughly $3 million. They bypassed the probate courts completely. They bypassed the insurance investigations entirely. They represented a massive invisible fortune that could be liquidated in a matter of hours, solving every single one of Justin's violent illicit debts in a single stroke. Justin lunged blindly for the bait. The despair in his voice was instantly eradicated, replaced by a sudden manic elation. He practically shouted at Cameron, demanding that the attorney dispatch an armed courier to the Sterling Depository that very afternoon to retrieve the entire contents of the vault. He promised Cameron a staggering personal bonus, offering him $100,000 in cash if the bearer bonds were sitting on his kitchen counter by nightfall. The sheer blinding force of his greed completely erased any lingering pretense of mourning. He was a starving man who had just been handed the keys to a banquet. That was the precise moment Cameron introduced the reinforced steel wall. Cameron's voice dropped into a tone of profound, insurmountable legal regret. He explained that retrieving the bonds was entirely physically impossible under the current circumstances. He informed Justin that the Sterling Depository operated on a highly classified, self-contained legacy security grid. The specific subterranean unit I had leased was not secured by a traditional combination dial or a standard physical key. It was locked down by a military-grade biometric optical scanner. Cameron stated the devastating truth with brutal clarity. The vault mechanism required my living physical thumbprint to disengage the internal titanium locking rods. Cameron let the terrifying reality of that biometric requirement hang in the air. He gently reminded my son that given the catastrophic explosive nature of the house fire, my physical remains were hopelessly compromised. The municipal fire inspector had already officially documented that my body was virtually incinerated in the blast. Cameron stated with absolute legal finality that without my intact verifiable thumbprint, the vault protocol dictated that the box must remain permanently sealed in perpetuity. The $3 million in untraceable bearer bonds were effectively locked inside an impenetrable steel tomb forever. The reaction captured by the microphone was explosive. Justin unleashed a primal, terrifying roar of pure frustration. He violently swept his arm across the conference table. I heard the sharp, chaotic crashing of glass as water pitchers and coffee mugs shattered against the hardwood floor. The sudden agonizing proximity of his ultimate salvation, combined with its absolute inaccessibility, was driving him into a state of total psychological collapse. Megan began to cry, her sobs echoing loudly in the background, a pathetic soundtrack to their impending ruin. Justin refused to accept the finality of the biometric lock. He began interrogating Cameron with a barrage of aggressive, rapid-fire questions. He demanded to know the exact structural layout of the depository. He demanded the specific manufacturer and model number of the biometric scanner. He asked about the patrol routes of the armed security guards and the location of the main power grid. He was no longer speaking like an entitled corporate heir waiting for a legal transfer. He was speaking like a cornered, ruthless thief preparing to breach a fortress. Cameron played the role of the deeply uncomfortable, reluctant attorney perfectly. He provided Justin with just enough technical information to heavily fuel his obsession while maintaining absolute plausible deniability. Cameron repeatedly and sternly warned my son that the Sterling Depository was a literal fortress and that attempting to physically circumvent their biometric security grid was a severe federal crime that carried mandatory prison sentences. Justin completely ignored every single warning. The frantic, terrified tone of his voice hardened into a dark, obsessive calculation. I listened to him mutter feverishly under his breath. He paced the room again, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He insisted that no security system was entirely flawless. He reasoned out loud that there had to be a technical backdoor, a digital override protocol, or a physical vulnerability in the optical scanner itself. The bait had been swallowed entirely, hooking him deep in his most vulnerable, greedy instincts. He was absolutely convinced that he possessed the genius required to hack a military-grade vault and walk away with millions of dollars in untraceable cash. He abruptly ended the meeting, offering no apologies for the shattered glass or his violent outburst. I heard the heavy oak door open and slam shut with urgent, dangerous speed. The audio wave on my screen flattened back into a steady, quiet line. I reached up and slowly removed the headphones, setting them down gently on the motel table. A profound, icy satisfaction settled deeply into my chest. The psychological prison had been constructed flawlessly, and my son had just willingly locked himself inside. The final phase of the operation was now in motion, and there was absolutely no turning back. The industrial district of the city operated by its own grim logic. It was a sprawling wasteland of rusted shipping containers and abandoned manufacturing plants, where the desperate went to conduct business they could not afford to execute in the light of day. I sat in the back of an unmarked surveillance van parked 3 blocks away from a decaying textile warehouse. The interior of the van smelled of hot electronics and stale coffee. I stared at the glowing green audio waveforms dancing across my laptop screen. The trap was set, and the jaws were completely open. I simply needed my son to walk inside and speak. Stanley had orchestrated the entire rendezvous. When I first hired Stanley a decade ago, I knew he carried a specific set of skills from his military service and his subsequent years navigating the gray areas of private security. He maintained deep, quiet connections within the city's underworld. When Justin began frantically searching for a black market safecracker capable of bypassing a military-grade biometric vault, Stanley utilized those old connections to intercept the request. He positioned himself as the middleman, representing a mythical ghost of a hacker who only communicated through secure proxies. Stanley was currently standing inside that rotting warehouse wearing a hidden high-definition camera and a microscopic audio transmitter woven into the collar of his heavy leather jacket. I pressed the earpiece deeper into my canal. The audio feed crackled softly. I heard the unmistakable screech of rusty metal hinges as the heavy warehouse doors were pulled open. Footsteps echoed against the concrete floor. They were fast and erratic. Justin had arrived. He did not possess the cold, calculated demeanor of a hardened criminal. He sounded like a terrified amateur trying desperately to play a role he did not understand. Stanley spoke first. His voice was disguised, heavily modulated by a raspy, forced grit that commanded immediate authority. He demanded to know if Justin had brought the initial consultation fee. I heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy canvas bag hitting a wooden table. Justin spoke, his voice tight and breathless. He stated there was $20,000 in untraceable cash inside the bag. He insisted it was just a down payment and that the hacker would receive another $100,000 the moment the vault at the Sterling Depository was successfully breached. Stanley let a long, agonizing silence stretch across the warehouse. I could picture him staring Justin down, letting the sheer weight of the criminal environment crush my son's fragile arrogance. Stanley finally spoke, laughing, a low, mocking sound. He told Justin that $100,000 was an absolute insult for breaching a biometric legacy grid. Stanley explained that overriding an optical scanner required custom-fabricated silicone prints, retinal mapping software, and a terrifying amount of federal risk. He told Justin to take his miserable canvas bag and walk out the door. The panic in Justin escalated instantly. The audio wave on my screen spiked as he slammed his hand against the wooden table. He pleaded with Stanley. He swore he could double the payout once the bearer bonds were secured. He explained the entire situation with reckless detail, completely abandoning any sense of operational security. He told this complete stranger about the $2 million trust that was frozen by the insurance company. He complained bitterly about the probate lawyers and the endless bureaucratic nightmare delaying his inheritance. Stanley played his part with absolute perfection. He leaned in close, his voice dripping with aggressive skepticism. He asked Justin why they were standing in a freezing warehouse discussing a highly illegal vault breach. He asked the fatal question. Stanley demanded to know why Justin did not simply bring his wealthy father down to the depository and force the old man to press his thumb against the glass. The silence that followed was heavy and saturated with tension. I held my breath inside the surveillance van. I needed Justin to cross the point of no return. I needed him to articulate the darkness he harbored inside his heart. Justin let out a frustrated, ragged breath. He paced the concrete floor, his shoes scuffing loudly against the grit. He told Stanley that bringing his father to the vault was a physical impossibility. He stated that his father was dead. Stanley pushed harder. He feigned annoyance, accusing Justin of wasting his time with a dead man's frozen assets. Stanley demanded to know how a man with millions of dollars in untraceable bearer bonds simply drops dead at the exact moment his son is drowning in illicit debt. Stanley accused Justin of being a liability, a sloppy amateur who was bound to bring the police crashing down on all of them. That was the precise moment the pressure broke him. The arrogant facade completely shattered. Justin lost his temper, unleashing a torrent of vitriol and entitlement that chilled me to the bone. He screamed that he was not a liability. He screamed that he had planned everything with absolute perfection. The audio feed captured every single horrifying syllable. Justin explicitly stated that setting the fire was supposed to solve every single problem in his life instantly. He complained loudly about the sheer physical effort it took to loosen the rusted gas valve in the basement of my home. He whined about how much he had paid the underground forger to draft the fake will months in advance. Justin raged against the universe, painting himself as the ultimate victim. He confessed that the explosion was designed to turn my house into a pile of white ash and leave him as the sole uncontested master of my empire. He yelled that he had done the dirty work, he had ignited the spark, and he deserved his God-given reward. He was furious that my murder had not resulted in a seamless, quiet transfer of wealth. He was outraged that the insurance adjusters and the probate judges were daring to look closely at the ashes he had created. He admitted to the forgery, the embezzlement, and the premeditated arson in a single, breathless, frantic monologue. I stared at the green line on my monitor, watching it record the absolute destruction of my son. He had just handed me the rope I needed to hang him. The confession was crystal clear, undeniable, and utterly devoid of any human remorse. He did not express a single ounce of sorrow for burning his father alive. His only regret was the administrative inconvenience my death had temporarily caused him. Stanley let the echoes of the confession fade into the damp air of the warehouse. He did not react with shock or moral outrage. He maintained the cold, transactional persona of a criminal broker. He told Justin to calm down and stop acting like a hysterical child. Stanley stated that he now understood the parameters of the job and the stakes involved. He instructed Justin to leave the $20,000 on the table and return home. Stanley promised to contact the hacker and determine if the biometric vault could be bypassed within the week. I listened to Justin exhale a long, shaky breath of relief. He sincerely believed he had just salvaged his master plan. He thanked Stanley with an embarrassing, pathetic eagerness. I heard his erratic footsteps retreat across the concrete floor. The heavy metal door shrieked open and then slammed shut, sealing the warehouse in silence once again. A few seconds later, the microphone picked up a distinct rhythmic tapping. It was Stanley signaling that the target had cleared the perimeter. I reached toward the laptop keyboard and hit the save command on the audio software. I exported the pristine high-definition file to 3 separate encrypted hard drives. The digital file was small, requiring only a few megabytes of storage, but it possessed enough destructive power to obliterate 2 lives entirely. The heavy side door of the surveillance van slid open, letting in a rush of humid night air. Stanley climbed into the back passenger seat, bringing the scent of rain and industrial exhaust with him. He reached under his heavy leather jacket and unclipped the microscopic transmitter, placing the recording device gently on the metal counter between us. He looked at me, his face illuminated by the pale blue glow of the laptop monitor. He did not offer any unnecessary commentary. He simply nodded, confirming that the visual feed from the hidden camera had also captured Justin's face perfectly during the entire rant. I looked down at the encrypted hard drives resting in my palm. The grief had been entirely burned away days ago, replaced by a terrifying, brilliant clarity. But hearing the actual words, hearing the sheer arrogant annoyance in my son's voice as he described my murder, triggered a final profound shift within my soul. The man who had raised Justin was completely dead. The father who had forgiven his early transgressions and paid off his youthful gambling debts no longer existed. I instructed Stanley to put the van in gear and drive us back to the motel. We had the ultimate weapon securely in our possession. Justin and Megan believed they were waiting for a magical hacker to unlock a vault of bearer bonds. They believed they were days away from paying off their violent creditors and stepping into a life of absolute luxury. I was going to let them hold on to that beautiful, intoxicating illusion for exactly 48 more hours. I was going to let them taste the victory before I ripped the ground out from under them permanently. The net was securely drawn, and the execution of their absolute ruin was about to begin. The motel room was suffocatingly quiet. I sat perfectly still in the uncomfortable plastic chair, staring at the high-definition video feed broadcasting to my laptop. Cameron Pierce had positioned a microscopic camera inside the spine of a thick law book on his bookshelf. The audio feed was crystal clear, capturing every rustle of paper and every shallow breath within the conference room. I had not slept in 2 days. The adrenaline pumping through my veins had completely replaced my need for rest. I was waiting for the final act of a play my son had written in blood and greed. The heavy oak door of Cameron's office swung open. The sound echoed through my headphones with a sharp, definitive crack. The final meeting had officially begun. Justin walked into the room first. He did not look like a man who had recently buried his father. He looked like a conqueror stepping into his newly acquired kingdom. He was wearing a brand new tailored suit. The fabric was a deep, rich charcoal gray, perfectly fitted to his shoulders. I knew the exact tailor he used downtown. A suit like that cost upward of $4,000. He had purchased it while drowning in illicit debt, entirely confident that my life insurance payout would cover his extravagant vanity. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His hair was impeccably styled. He radiated a sickening aura of premature victory. He believed he had outsmarted everyone. He believed the flames had washed away all his sins. Megan followed closely behind him. Her demeanor was equally appalling. She wore a sleek ivory dress that spoke of expensive boutiques and high society luncheons. She held a glossy travel magazine loosely in one hand and her cellular phone in the other. As she walked across the plush carpet, she was actively speaking to someone on speakerphone. She was loudly discussing the availability of first-class flights to Rome. She complained to the travel agent that the layovers in London were simply unacceptable and demanded that they find a direct route. She was booking a luxury European vacation while walking into a law office to collect the profits of her father-in-law's murder. Her callousness was absolute. She did not even possess the basic decency to fake a moment of sorrow. Cameron sat behind his massive mahogany desk like a stone statue. His expression was completely unreadable. He did not stand to greet them. He did not offer his condolences. He simply watched them cross the room with the cold, detached gaze of an executioner. Justin sank into the plush leather chair opposite the desk. He crossed his legs, resting one polished shoe on his knee. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and offered Cameron a wide, familiar smile. It was the exact same smile he used to give me when he wanted to borrow money for a new car or beg for an extension on a loan. It was a smile completely devoid of genuine warmth. It was a tool of manipulation. Justin spoke first. His voice was smooth and practiced. He told Cameron that it was a beautiful morning and that he was incredibly relieved to finally put this entire tragic ordeal behind them. He actually used the word ordeal. He spoke about my death as if it were a minor inconvenience, a traffic jam that had temporarily delayed his arrival. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He told Cameron that he and Megan had suffered immense emotional trauma over the past few weeks. He claimed they desperately needed to leave the city to clear their heads and begin the healing process. The healing process, he explained, apparently required a $2 million cash injection and a month-long stay in a 5-star Italian villa. I watched the screen, my hands clenched into tight fists. I analyzed every micro-expression on my son's face. I looked for a single trace of guilt, a fleeting shadow of remorse, or even a nervous tick. There was absolutely nothing. His eyes were bright with anticipation. His skin was flushed with the intoxicating thrill of sudden unearned wealth. He had successfully rationalized patricide. He had convinced himself that he deserved this money, that it was his birthright, and that I had simply been an obstacle standing in the way of his destiny. He was a monster wearing a very expensive disguise. Megan finally ended her phone call, tossing the travel magazine onto the desk. She sighed loudly, complaining about the incompetence of airline booking agents. She looked at Cameron with an expression of intense boredom. She asked if they could expedite the signing process. She stated that they had a reservation at a very exclusive restaurant for lunch, and she absolutely detested being late. She treated the finalization of my estate transfer like a tedious trip to the dry cleaners. She wanted her money, and she wanted to leave. She did not care about the legal protocols or the solemn nature of the paperwork. She only cared about the clearance of the funds. Cameron did not react to her insolence. He slowly opened a thick, black leather binder resting in the center of his desk. The sound of the heavy pages turning was amplified through the audio feed. Cameron's voice was low and commanding. He informed Justin that the life insurance conglomerate had concluded their secondary review. He stated that the probate court had officially authorized the release of the primary liquid assets. He confirmed that the $2 million trust and the massive insurance payout were fully cleared for immediate transfer. The words hung in the air like a siren song. Justin's reaction was visceral. The microphone picked up his sudden sharp intake of breath. He uncrossed his legs and leaned closer to the desk, his eyes locked onto the leather binder. His pupils dilated. The veneer of the grieving son evaporated entirely, leaving only raw, naked greed. He asked Cameron to confirm that the funds would be available in his personal accounts by the end of the business day. Cameron nodded slowly. He assured Justin that once the final release forms were signed, the wire transfer would be initiated within the hour. The money would be completely his, uncontested and unencumbered. Megan clapped her hands together, letting out a short, delighted laugh. She turned to Justin and told him that they could definitely upgrade to the presidential suite in Rome. Justin reached over and squeezed her hand, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. He told Cameron that this was excellent news. He praised Cameron for his efficiency, completely oblivious to the fact that my attorney was carefully guiding him onto a trapdoor. Justin stated that he knew his father would have wanted him to have this security. He had the absolute audacity to invoke my name to use my supposed wishes to justify his theft. I felt a strange sensation wash over me as I watched them celebrate. It was not anger. The anger had burned out long ago. It was a profound, chilling detachment. I was watching two strangers. I realized that the boy I had raised had died long before the fire. He had been consumed by a slow, creeping rot of entitlement and moral bankruptcy. The man sitting in that office was simply a predator who had worn my son's face. And now the predator was about to step directly into the snare. Cameron pulled a thick stack of documents from the binder and slid them across the smooth mahogany surface. The papers came to rest directly in front of Justin. Cameron explained the nature of the documents. He stated that these were the absolute final, irrevocable release authorizations. By signing these pages, Justin was officially accepting the full transfer of the estate, acknowledging his role as the sole executor and legally binding himself to the terms of the revised will. Cameron made sure to emphasize the revised will, the very document Justin had paid a criminal to forge. Justin did not hesitate. He did not ask to read the fine print. He did not consult with independent counsel. He was completely blinded by the proximity of the millions. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit coat. He pulled out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. I recognized it instantly. It was a vintage pen I had received as a corporate gift decades ago. It had sat in a display case in my home office for years. It was the exact same pen the forensic expert had identified. Justin had stolen it to forge my signature, and now he was going to use it to sign his own name, completing the circle of his arrogance. He spun the gold pen between his fingers with practiced ease. He looked down at the crisp white documents. Megan leaned over his shoulder, her eyes tracing the dense legal text. She pointed a manicured finger at the bottom of the page, showing him exactly where to sign. The atmosphere in the conference room grew incredibly dense. The microphone captured the subtle shifting of fabric, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, and the rapid, eager breathing of the two conspirators. I leaned closer to my laptop screen in the dark motel room. I did not blink. I wanted to witness every single fraction of a second of this moment. Cameron sat perfectly still, his hands folded neatly on the desk. He watched Justin uncap the fountain pen. The golden nib caught the light streaming in from the large office window. Justin smoothed the first page of the document with his left hand. He positioned his right hand over the signature line. The tension reached its absolute agonizing peak. This was the precipice. Once that ink touched the paper, Justin was legally committing himself to the entire fraudulent scheme on the official record. He was claiming the stolen funds. He was authenticating the forged will. He was stepping over the invisible line between a planned crime and an executed reality. He lowered the pen. The gold nib hovered a single millimeter above the paper. He paused for a fraction of a second, completely unaware that he was about to sign his own destruction. The gold nib of Justin's fountain pen hovered a fraction of an inch above the pristine white paper. Before the wet ink could bleed into the fibers and seal his victory, the heavy oak door of the conference room swung open. The sound was not violent, but the slow, deliberate click of the brass handle echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence of the room. I stepped across the threshold. I did not look like a man who had perished in a raging inferno 48 hours earlier. I wore my favorite navy blue bespoke suit, freshly pressed, paired with a crisp white shirt and a maroon silk tie. My silver hair was neatly combed, and my posture was perfectly straight. I walked into the room with the quiet, undeniable authority of a man who owned the building and everything inside it. Justin froze completely. The expensive fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the mahogany desk, and leaving a jagged streak of black ink across the fraudulent release forms. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly white. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. Megan dropped her phone. The device hit the plush carpet with a dull thud. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Her eyes were wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. They were staring at a ghost. They were staring at the walking, breathing manifestation of their ultimate failure. Cameron Pierce did not flinch. My attorney remained perfectly still behind his desk, watching the trap spring shut with cold, professional satisfaction. I walked slowly toward the empty chair beside Justin. The silence in the room was so profound, it felt heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the faint drumming of the rain against the large plate glass windows. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and withdrew a small silver flash drive and a neatly folded stack of papers. I did not throw them. I placed them down methodically, setting them directly on top of the insurance transfer documents Justin had been so eager to sign. The soft slap of the paper against the desk broke the trance. Justin stumbled backward in his leather chair, pressing his spine against the upholstery, as if trying to physically distance himself from my presence. He finally managed to choke out my name, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a calm, freezing precision that left absolutely no room for negotiation or denial. I told him that he looked genuinely surprised. I asked him if the tailored charcoal suit he was wearing was purchased specifically for his sudden ascension to wealth. I noted that it was an incredibly bold choice to wear such expensive fabric while supposedly grieving a father who had burned to ashes. Megan began to stammer a frantic, incoherent stream of denials and false joy. She tried to say it was a miracle that they thought they had lost me forever, but the sheer panic vibrating in her eyes betrayed every single word. I cut her off immediately. I instructed her to be quiet. I told her the theatrical performance was officially over and the audience had gone home. I turned my attention entirely back to my son. I pointed to the stack of papers I had placed on the desk. I informed him that the first document was a comprehensive forensic analysis of the revised will he had submitted to the probate court. I explained that the handwriting expert had easily identified the fraudulent signature. I watched Justin swallow hard, a thick bead of cold sweat forming at his temple and rolling down his jaw. I told him I knew all about the vintage fountain pen he had stolen from my private study to make the forgery look authentic. I knew about the extensive, meticulous premeditation. He had hired a professional forger months before the fire, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that my murder was not a sudden act of passion, but a cold, calculated business transaction. I then addressed the underlying motive driving their desperation. I turned slightly to look at Megan, who was now trembling visibly, her manicured hands gripping the armrests of her chair. I calmly listed the exact figures of her underground debts. I named the industrial lenders she had borrowed from to fund her failing luxury boutique. I saw the absolute horror wash over her face as she realized her deepest, most dangerous secrets were entirely exposed to the light. I pivoted back to Justin and recited the exact dates and the exact dollar amounts of the $50,000 he had embezzled from my architectural firm. I explained that their desperate, lethal financial situation was no longer a secret. I knew they needed the $2 million commercial trust instantly to save their own lives from the violent men they owed. Justin tried to mount a pathetic defense. He weakly denied the accusations, claiming the fire was a horrible tragedy, and the corporate embezzlement was simply a massive accounting error. His lies were completely transparent, crumbling the very moment they left his mouth. I tapped my index finger against the silver flash drive resting on the polished mahogany. I told him to save his breath. I explained that the drive contained high-definition security footage from a camera hidden directly near the basement gas meter of my home. I described exactly what the video showed. I detailed how he had crept into the cellar in the dead of night, taking a heavy wrench to the main valve, deliberately flooding the house with lethal gas while I slept upstairs. Then I delivered the final crushing blow to his crumbling reality. I told him about the rusted warehouse in the industrial district. I mentioned the $20,000 in untraceable cash he had brought in a heavy canvas bag. I saw his eyes widen in pure, blinding disbelief. I explained that the shadowy middleman he had hired to crack the biometric vault at the Sterling Depository was actually my private security contractor. I informed him that every single word he had spoken in that freezing warehouse was recorded on hidden audio and video equipment. I recited his own disgusting words back to him. I reminded him how he had loudly complained about the physical effort required to break the gas valve. I reminded him how he had explicitly stated that my death was supposed to solve all his problems seamlessly and not create administrative nightmares. The absolute gravity of his situation finally crushed him. The arrogant, entitled posture collapsed entirely. Justin slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. A wretched, guttural sob ripped through his chest, echoing terribly in the quiet office. He was not crying out of remorse for attempting to murder his father. He was weeping because his flawless master plan had disintegrated into dust, and he was staring down the barrel of a lifetime in a federal penitentiary. Megan sat entirely frozen, her chest heaving in silent, rapid panic, trapped in a living nightmare from which she could not wake up. I stood over them, feeling a profound and unshakable peace. For decades I had provided for this boy, protected him, and excused his endless transgressions. I had allowed my paternal love to blind me to the cold, sociopathic monster he had slowly become. But the flames he had ignited to destroy me had instead burned away all my illusions. I told him that he had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed that because I was his father, I would be an easy, trusting target. He had failed completely to realize that the exact same ruthless determination I used to build my empire would be turned directly against him the moment he threatened my life. I looked across the desk at Cameron Pierce, who was already gathering the fraudulent estate documents and sliding them smoothly into a secure shredder basket. I turned my gaze back to the trembling, broken figures of my son and his wife. I informed them that the city police were already waiting in the lobby downstairs. The Financial Crimes Division had pristine copies of the embezzlement records, and the homicide detectives had the security footage from the gas meter and the clear warehouse confession. They were leaving the law office in handcuffs today. They would not receive a single penny of my wealth. They would face the full, unmitigated wrath of the criminal justice system, and whatever protection or love I had once offered them was permanently, irrevocably revoked. I adjusted my silk tie, turned my back on the absolute wreckage of their lives, and walked out of the conference room without a single backward glance. The instinct of a cornered predator is always to run, and Justin proved no different. The sheer gravity of the moment hung in the air for a fraction of a second before his survival reflex violently kicked in. He shoved his heavy leather chair backward with explosive force. The thick wooden legs scraped harshly against the polished hardwood floor, creating a screeching sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. He spun around blindly, searching for an exit that did not exist. His eyes darted toward the large plate glass windows, but we were 20 stories above the concrete pavement. He looked toward the side door leading to the filing room, but his frantic mind realized there was no escape route through the secure labyrinth of the law firm. He was entirely trapped inside the very room where he had planned to claim his stolen empire. He took one desperate step toward the main entrance, before his Italian leather shoe could fully plant itself on the carpet. The heavy oak door swung open wide. The arrival was perfectly timed. 2 federal investigators stepped across the threshold. They wore immaculate dark suits and carried an air of absolute, unwavering authority. Behind them stood 2 uniformed city police officers, their hands resting casually but firmly near their utility belts. The sudden influx of law enforcement instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen from the room. The atmosphere transformed from a tense confrontation into a sealed tomb. The lead federal investigator stepped forward. He was a tall man with a weathered face and a voice that brooked absolutely no argument. He did not yell or draw a weapon. He spoke with the terrifying calm of a man who held a royal flush. He addressed Justin by his full legal name. He announced that he was placing Justin under immediate arrest. The investigator began to list the charges with methodical precision. He cited conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He cited premeditated arson of an occupied dwelling. He cited federal insurance fraud. Then he delivered the final devastating blow. He cited the attempted murder of Harold Pierce. The words fell upon Justin like physical strikes. His entire body went limp. The manic energy that had fueled his escape attempt vanished completely. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender as the uniformed officers moved in. The sharp metallic clicking of the handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists resonated through the quiet office. It was the sound of absolute finality. It was the sound of his lavish future being permanently erased. Megan had remained frozen in her chair, entirely paralyzed by the sudden collapse of their reality. The sight of the steel cuffs binding her husband's wrists finally shattered her catatonic state. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream. It was not a scream of sorrow for her husband. It was a scream of pure, selfish terror. An officer approached her side, asking her to stand up and place her hands behind her back. Megan completely unraveled. The polished, sophisticated facade she had maintained for years dissolved into a messy, pathetic display of desperation. She scrambled away from the officer, pressing herself against the edge of the conference table. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Justin. Her voice cracked as she began to sob uncontrollably. She screamed that she had absolutely nothing to do with the fire. She wailed that it was all his idea. She claimed that Justin was a controlling monster who had forced her to go along with the scheme. She begged the federal agents to listen to her. She insisted that she only wanted to pay off her boutique suppliers and that she never wanted anyone to get hurt. She threw the man she had married completely under the bus without a single second of hesitation. Justin slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The betrayal in his eyes was absolute. He was watching the woman who had helped him plot his father's murder abandon him the very moment the consequences arrived. They had built their entire marriage on a foundation of mutual greed and shared lies. Now that the foundation had collapsed, they were turning on each other like starving wolves. Megan continued to scream and cry as the female officer firmly secured her wrists in handcuffs, reciting her Miranda rights over her pathetic wailing. Justin looked away from his wife. His breathing was shallow and erratic. The sophisticated, arrogant air had been completely erased. In his place stood a broken, terrified little boy facing a lifetime behind reinforced concrete and steel bars. He turned his desperate, hollow eyes toward me. He took a small, shuffling step forward, restricted by the officer's grip on his arms. The tears began to spill down his face, ruining his perfectly manicured appearance. He called me Dad. The words sounded foreign and disgusting coming from his mouth. He begged me to help him. He pleaded for mercy, using a trembling, pathetic voice. He told me that he was sick and that the pressure of his debts had driven him completely out of his mind. He brought up memories of his childhood. He talked about the times we had gone fishing on the lake and the summer afternoons I had spent teaching him how to ride a bicycle. He was desperately trying to reach into the past to find a shred of the paternal love he had systematically destroyed. He cried that he was my only son and that I could not possibly let them take him away to rot in a federal prison. I stood perfectly still. I did not move toward him. I did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. I looked at the tears streaming down his face and I felt absolutely nothing. The well of forgiveness had run completely dry. I looked at this weeping man and remembered the high-definition video of him walking into my cellar with a heavy wrench. I remembered the cold, calculated audio recording of him complaining about the physical effort it took to open the gas line. I remembered his absolute lack of remorse as he sat in this very room, just moments ago, eager to collect the bounty of my ashes. I met his frantic, pleading gaze with eyes as cold as glacial ice. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, resonant clarity that sliced through his pathetic sobbing. I told him that I did not know the man standing in front of me. I told him that the man in the charcoal suit was a thief, a liar, and a coward. I looked deep into his terrified soul. I told him that my son had died in the fire he set. The impact of those words struck him with physical force. His knees buckled slightly. The last remaining shred of hope vanished from his eyes. He realized in that exact moment that there would be no rescue. There would be no secret legal maneuvering. There would be no parental forgiveness to shield him from the consequences of his actions. He was entirely alone. I turned my back on him. I did not want to look at his face for another second. The sight of him disgusted me. I nodded briefly to the lead federal investigator, signaling that I was finished. The officers pulled Justin and Megan toward the heavy oak door. Megan was still sobbing loudly, dragging her feet and pleading with anyone who would listen. Justin walked in utter silence, his head hung low in complete defeat. The door closed behind them, cutting off the chaotic sounds of their arrest. The conference room settled back into a heavy, profound silence. Cameron Pierce stood up from behind his massive desk. He straightened his suit jacket and offered me a small, respectful nod. The legal mechanics of the trap had executed flawlessly. Stanley stepped out from the adjacent observation room. He carried his heavy leather jacket over one arm. He did not say a word, but his posture conveyed absolute satisfaction. The operation was a complete success. I walked toward the door, Cameron and Stanley falling in step behind me. We moved through the quiet corridors of the law firm. The administrative staff kept their heads down, sensing the massive shift in gravity that had just occurred. We entered the private executive elevator. The descent to the ground floor was silent and swift. The metal doors slid open, revealing the expansive marble lobby. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out onto the city sidewalk. The rain had finally stopped completely. The heavy dark clouds were beginning to break apart, allowing beams of bright afternoon sunlight to pierce through the gray canopy. The air was incredibly crisp and clean. It smelled of wet asphalt and fresh beginnings. I took a deep, prolonged breath, filling my lungs with the cool air. A profound sense of liberation washed over me. The invisible chains of obligation and toxic loyalty that had bound me to Justin for decades were permanently severed. The parasitic infection that had been slowly draining the life from my empire was eradicated. I had lost a son, but I had regained my own life. I had walked through the fire and emerged entirely forged in steel. My private driver pulled the black sedan up to the curb. Stanley opened the rear door for me, a silent gesture of genuine respect. I looked at Stanley and then back at Cameron, who was standing by the glass doors of his firm. These were men who had proven their loyalty through action, not entitlement. They had stood by me when I was nothing more than a ghost, hunting for truth. I was no longer surrounded by leeches disguised as family. I was surrounded by a fortress of my own choosing. I stepped into the comfortable leather interior of the sedan. I instructed the driver to take me home. It was time to clear the ashes, to rebuild the structure, and to live the rest of my days entirely on my own terms. The car pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the flowing city traffic, leaving the wreckage of the past completely behind. True family is never defined simply by blood, but rather by unwavering loyalty, mutual respect, and genuine care. When the people you trust the most view your existence merely as a stepping stone for their own greedy ambitions, clinging to the illusion of love only invites destruction. Walking away from toxic relationships, even those bound by genetics, is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of survival. By setting absolute boundaries and allowing the truth to surface, you protect your own peace and clear the path to surround yourself only with those who truly value your life. If you found this story of reclaiming power and demanding justice inspiring, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts and subscribe for more thrilling narratives.